Applied linguistics, components of language learning, that is to say, we are in second language acquisition. We are going to deal with five topics: situational factors, input, learner differences, learner processes, and output. The first one is situational factors. We have two types of contexts for learning. We have naturalistic and instructed. Naturalistic learning happens within a non-instructional community in which the learner is exposed to the target language at work or in social interaction, or a school where instruction is directed at native speakers, that is to say, immigrants. And the other option is instructed context, which normally happens in the language classroom or with the new technologies, autonomous learning. There are not better or worse learning contexts, they only offer different learning opportunities. And this influence of the social settings can be found in two things. One is the contact or not with the vernacular varieties, and the existence or non-existence or lack of existence of negotiation of meaning. Um, Where do we find this more usually? For example, the contact with vernacular varieties occur more usually in naturalistic contexts, and the negotiation of meaning occurs more usually in naturalistic environment. Why? Because um, negotiation of meanings are conversations in interlocutors trying to overcome communication problems by selecting certain topics, topic shifting, checking of comprehension, requests for clarification, slower pace, repetition. Negotiation of meaning can be focused on form or meaning. As I was saying, there are things which occur more in one context than in the other. For example, error correction is more usually found in instructed learning. For example, a teacher will all the time be correcting you if you make mistakes. About error correction, it is important that the person that is corrected sees or finds the person that is correcting him as an authority to do so. Otherwise, he or she will not take it into account for improving. Then grading of language occurs also in instructed places because it is more usual in formal instruction. Time available for learning is people have more time to study or they are forced to speak all the time in a naturalistic context. So the person that is abroad, for example, has to speak up all the time, whereas a classroom lasts only 1 or 2 hours per day, or per week, or per month. Then the ability of natives, the variety of language, the pressure to speak is more usually found in naturalistic contexts, and the access to modified input is more usual in instructed contexts. For example, the teacher will use more general words, will say or write shorter sentences, will use many synonyms in an instructed environment than in a naturalistic environment that where the native will not be so worried if the learner is not understanding. So, as I said, the context has influence in the existence or non-existence of negotiation of meaning, more or less contact with vernacular varieties, and it has an impact on learning language production. only, also the context. And this has to do with scaffolding. Scaffolding refers to a method in which teachers offer a particular kind of support to students as they learn and develop a new concept or skill. In a scaffolding, in a scaffolding model, a teacher may share new information or demonstrate how to solve a problem. The teacher then gradually steps back and lets students practice on their own. Before the students become completely independent, structured support, scaffolding, is put in place, such as group practice. Students might work together in small groups to help each other. This process in education is also sometimes called I do, we do, you do. In other words, the teacher shows how something is done, then the class practices together, and finally, students work individually. So this this is a this method is only found in instructed contexts. Then the second topic is input. And the first thing we have to talk about input is the difference between input and intake. Because input is the language which the learner is exposed to, either written or spoken in the environment, whereas intake is the attended, processed, and understood input. Um, so this is real learning, let's say. This distinction is fundamental because it is intake that leads to learning. Then, how does each of the biggest SLA approaches understand input? The behaviorist position say that children learn by imitating their interlocutors and receiving feedback on their utterances. This way, they reinforce or correct them, and the innatists say that it is a mere trigger that activates the internal mechanisms that we are all born with. And lastly, the interactionist says that acquisition is the result of the interplay between the learner's mental abilities and the linguistic environment. So there are different ways of understanding input. There are five types of modified input. We have Mother S, we have foreign talk, teacher talk. Then we can talk about different types of classroom language. And then we have how Prussians understand that should be uh, input in the classroom. Mother S is child-directed speech. It is the characteristic that it has is that it has a higher intonation. It uses less words. It uses general words, and it is the usual way a mother talks to their babies. Foreign talk which is simplified talk used by native speakers to address non-native speakers. Although the basic function of foreign talk is to facilitate communication, it may indirectly provide a teaching learning opportunity. Teacher talk is characterized by having formal adjustments in syntax. The teacher uses shorter utterances and formal adjustments in pronunciation. The teacher uses a more accurate standard pronunciation, and Lexis, the teacher uses more general words. In contrast with foreign talk, teacher does not contain ungrammatical speech. Ellis reports four types of language use that have been identified in the classroom: mechanical with no exchange of meaning, meaningful but where there is no real information conveyed, pseudo-communicative, where information is exchanged within a way that would be unlikely to occur outside the classroom, and real communication, which consists of spontaneous natural speech. Then Gratian says talks about a model that is called I plus one. It says that in order to progress, to develop language, and to yes to learn more or quicker and better, um, the input has to be I plus one. That is to say, it has to be easy to be acquired, but it has to add something new because otherwise the person will be in the same level all the time. It won't progress. The characteristics of input affecting the rate of acquisition is the amount, it is very important, the amount of or the quantity of input a learner receives is very important. That is why uh, it is an advice that they read and listen all that they can. Then the perceived need to communicate in L2. For example, if the learner is not uh, so pushed, let's say, to speak, he or she will remain silent. Then control of the content. For example, the rate of acquisition will be faster if there is like a leveling and grading. Um, if it goes topic by topic, but if it is all mixed up and the person cannot find a root, let's say, it will be harder. And opportunities and activity to practice. If the person does not like to speak up in front of other people, try to make them speak individually, for example. Learner differences is a topic that is of highly interest for SLA research because they try to understand or explain how to explain learning outcomes, especially as regards the rate of learning and levels of achievements. Learner differences are or individual differences are difficult to define and classify. So Ellie proposes to differentiate them between personal and general. The first are highly idiosyncratic features of each individual approach to learning L2, and the latter are characteristic of all learners. And we have to remember that every learner differences have different affective, social, and cognitive aspects that also uh, are intertwined with this with the root of learning, with language acquisition. General factors are of two types: modifiable, likely to change during the learning process, and unmodifiable, both personal. Uh, oh. And then we are going to talk about the personal factors. This is very short. It is very short the explanation of this. There are three types. Uh, had to do with the learner plus the group, the learner plus the teacher plus course materials, and individual learning techniques. Personal factors, for example, how the learner feels in the group. That is learning the language. Because in a group there is always competitiveness, and self-esteem is um, the lack of self-esteem um, is another factor involved in the learning process in a group. Then, how does the student feel about the teacher and the course material is also important, and individual learning techniques. Um, it depends on, there are many things having an influence on this. How many learning techniques has the student, and how many does he know? And not only learning techniques, but also metacognitive techniques. That is how the learner thinks or rethinks about her thinking. And finally, general factors. We have five: personality, intelligence and aptitude, cognitive learning styles, and motivation. This is the last slide. Well, about personality, personality refers to individual differences in characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. Thinking, feeling, and behaving. It was thought that extroverted people were better are at learning languages, and it was proved that this is not true. It is a myth because it doesn't affect the rate of acquisition. Maybe it makes the rate of acquisition faster, and also gaining communicative competence, but it's not uh, a determinant factor. Then intelligence and aptitude. What is the difference? Intelligence is the ability to learn and understand things in general, whereas aptitude are specific cognitive qualities needed for SLA, which are four. And we have uh, phonemic coding ability, grammatical sensitivity, inductive language learning ability, and root learning ability. Phonemic coding ability, it is the ability to understand for more than a few seconds and to retain uh, sounds, words, and pronunciation. Um, then in the grammatical sensitivity is has to do with language awareness of realizing without noticing, without being aware of this, the functions of words, the categories, um, etc. And then inductive language learning ability is the ability to identify patterns of correspondence and relationships involving form and meaning. And then the root learning ability, and this has to deal with being autonomous learning. Those learners who quickly realize how to keep on studying and progressing by themselves. Um, and then cognitive learning styles uh, are the preferred refer to the preferred way an individual processes information. For example, some people prefer more visual uh, input, others audio, others kinesthetic, and others are tactile. Um, for it is, um, for example, it is obvious that a person which is more auditory will find easier to sit for an exam, for an interpretation exam, than a person that is tactile, for example. But it is not determinant. And then motivation is defined as the process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal oriented behaviors. Motivation involves the biological, emotional, social, and cognitive forces that activate behavior. And about this topic, we have the action control theory, which describe the pre-decisional and post-decisional phases of learning. That is to say, all the things a learner do before, during, and after uh, learning that helps him persist and keep on track to uh, follow their goals. An age, um, there are two theories. We have one that has it is the sensitive period theory that says that children are are it's better to learn a language or easier to learn a language in the early stage of life before the onset of childhood because due to cerebral plasticity decrease decrease because the the interaction of neurons decreases over time. But there is also the opposite view that says that older people have other factors helping them acquire a second language. For example, they have more time available. They are able to make deductions. They are able to make uh, complex solving complex solving activities, um, and they have motivation. They are resilient, etc. There are many other factors, not only the cerebral plasticity facilitating language acquisition. But there is true that children acquire much better the phonemic system than older people because um, first their ears, their their listening system, let's say, uh, adapted better to adapt better to that phonemic code system, and the, the the way of positioning the mouth, the teeth, etc., is quickerly learned than older. But this is not permanent also. So that will be all about these three topics. We will continue with the rest.